All right, greetings from my living room on a Saturday afternoon. We're going to try doing a video lesson here. The last chapter I left y'all on your own, and this one we're going to try do the video recording so you can watch it at your own pace. Let me remind you, of course, this is a video. You can pause, you can stop, you can back up, you can do whatever. So obviously right now, if you don't have your books and your outline, I sent you the outline recently for chapter 13, the presidency, road to the White House. I think the outline is just labeled the presidency. So you need to get that out, get that ready to go. Get your books, get it open to page 281, and and you'll be ready to go. So you can pause, and I don't need to pause while you're pausing. So, all right, so the next section is on the executive branch. We finished our last branch was on the legislative branch, and now we're going to talk about the executive branch. Whether or not we make it to the judicial branch, we'll see. So chapter 13 is the presidency, the road to the White House. Chapter 14 is also on the presidency, and I'll give you a separate outline for that. So again, I need to take notes. If you want to take your own notes, I know some of you do. I know traditionally about a third of you take the notes I give you, about a third of you do your own notes, and about a third of you just try to fake it without the notes. So hopefully everybody will be moving towards either your own notes or my notes. So chapter 13, the presidency, and again, as in class, I'll point out stuff to you. I just can't write anything on the board. But again, you can always stop and look it up or whatever. All right, so first thing we talk about is the presidential qualities. What does it take to be a president? Sometimes you might wonder. If you look at back at the history of the presidency and the people who've been presidents, that's kind of the book says kind of a study of United States history in miniature. Some presidents have been, I guess, what we call great presidents. Some presidents have been okay presidents. Some presidents have been good. Some presidents have been kind of poor. So some presidents have shaped the nation. They've changed things. They made it a different world, the world in which we live. Other presidents have just been kind of taken along by events. George Washington, for example, I would still argue that George Washington was our greatest president. I know we've had a lot of great presidents since then, but there's so many things he did that would have made for a whole different country, a whole different presidency. He basically provided leadership and integrity that set the young republic on its way and gave us a pattern for future presidents. There are things that were ignored, but obviously, the things that he did were very important in establishing who and what we are and what presidents should be like. The founding fathers in the Constitution, in Article 2, remember Article 2 is what describes the executive branch. Article 1 was the legislative branch. Remember that on the test, one of the things you're allowed to use besides your notes, of course, is your copy of the Constitution. So the founding fathers gave pretty broad descriptions of what the president should be like. I'll read from Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. No person except a natural-born citizen shall be eligible to the office of president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident of the United States. That's pretty simple then. Natural-born citizen, what's a natural-born citizen? Whatever Congress says, it's a natural-born citizen. 35 years old and a resident of the United States. Obviously, in our recent years, we seem to have been leaning more towards older presidents than younger. Basically, there are two main avenues to the White House, and that's a test question for you. One way has been a successful military career. Examples of that, of course, would be George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, and Dwight Eisenhower. Those are good examples of people who got the White House through a military career. Grant and Eisenhower, of course, were West Point graduates. And then the second main avenue is through lower level politics. They either came up through state legislatures, or they came up through governorships, or they came up through Congress. Many of our presidents have either been governors or have been senators. If you go back and look at the numbers, that takes count a lot of them. You think about a lot of our candidates, that's true. Basically, that's how you get recognition. Of course, there are some big examples. Herbert Herbert Hoover was an engineer. Ronald Reagan, you might remember, was an actor and a movie personality, but he was also a governor too. George H.W. Bush had been a businessman, and his son, George W. Bush, was also a businessman, and he also was a managing general partner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. Of course, his father, George W. Bush had also been a governor of Texas, and his father had been a congressman. So they still kind of fit into that. All right, so the second big area on your outline says nomination, okay? If you look on page 283, there's actually a step-by-step process there for steps in the presidential nomination. As the book says, it's not for the self-doubters of faint of heart. It's tough, and of course, in our day and age, takes millions and millions of dollars to continue. Some people eventually drop out because the money is run out. So the steps are there. Step one, the candidate announces his or her plan to run for the presidency. These days, that's getting earlier and earlier. Step two, the candidate campaigns to win delegate and potential voter support. The delegates are party representatives who pledge to support the candidate's nomination at the National Party Convention. As you may know, the conventions for this year, because of the coronavirus, have been put off for a little while. And the whole concept of running for the president or the Democrat nomination has been really disrupted by what's going on. Step three, caucuses and primary elections take place in states. That's how we nominate our presidential candidates. Step four, at the National Party Convention, the nominee is selected and announced, and the election actually begins. The candidate goes to lots of events and speeches and debates and stuff like that. Step five, citizens cast their votes on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and the ballot is used to select a group of electors in the Electoral College. It's not a direct election. Step six, the Electoral College casts its vote on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. In every state except Maine and Nebraska, all the electoral votes go to the candidate who leads the popular vote. At least 270 electoral votes are required. Step seven, the president is inaugurated on January 20th of the following year. All right, so that's the step outline. So let's go back and look at your outline. It says primary hurdles is the first thing underneath there. And the Constitution does not spell out how you go about choosing presidential candidates. You remember at the beginning of our country, we didn't have party labels, and people just voted. The one who received the most electoral votes, and the electors were chosen. Each state assembly chose their electors, and the electors voted. The one who received the most votes would become president. The runner-up would become vice president. Obviously, that way of doing things, where I'm getting the two best guys, two best people, that didn't last very long. That's what caused the rise of presidential primaries, okay? And about at least three questions in here, okay? Make sure you got good notes in this next section, is at least three good questions. So early in the 20th century, if you remember for last year from history, we had the populist movement followed by the progressive movement, big movement for making government more responsible directly to individuals. And so there's a lot of feeling that lots of things were unconventional. People thought that the conventions that were used to nominate the president were not democratic because, again, the powers that be decided. So test questions in. So the method proposed was to give control of party nominations to what was called a direct primary. So direct primaries needs to be in your notes. The direct primary was a preliminary nominating election that was held to select candidates or delegates. States handle different to party conventions, okay? Here's another one for you, test question. 1903, Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, became the first state to allow direct primaries for state offices. The idea behind the presidential primary was to not let political bosses, the power people, run and control the presidential nomination process. All right, here's another test question for you. This caucus should be on your outline as well. The states that do not hold primaries use a district or state convention called a caucus, okay? The most famous caucus is the Iowa caucus, but some other states have caucuses. Alaska has a caucus. So Iowa caucus is the first one that gets a lot of notoriety. So party members by the thousands basically show up and vote, and their votes don't necessarily correspond to the state's delegate supports, but it gives some people an idea. And even though it's only 1 out of 50 states, people consider the Iowa caucus very, very important in outlining what they think might happen in the future. In the presidential primary elections, which are held in the months before the National Party Convention, the voters in each state usually choose a candidate they want their party to nominate for president. So Republican voters choose a Republican candidate, Democratic voters choose a Democratic candidate. And they're spread out over a several-month period there again. This year, that's been kind of disrupted by COVID-19. So those are not quite done. They basically, Iowa caucus is in January. The very first primaries in New Hampshire, those are considered very, very important. And then the large mass of primaries was in Tuesday, basically Super Tuesday, when you have quite a few states, including Texas, in March. And then, of course, it's supposed to be a few in April and a fair number in May, and some as late as June. Obviously, this year, everything's kind of disrupted. So a couple more test question for you. Primaries are conducted by the states, and there's several forms. One form is called the closed primary. Closed and open primary should be on your outline. Closed primaries are primaries in which, in order to vote, you must be a registered member of that party. So you must be a registered Republican to vote in the Republican primary. You must be a registered Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary. And you can only vote in the primary in which you're a registered member. In open primaries, you don't have to declare your party membership. You just choose whether you want to vote for Republican candidates or Democratic candidates. Texas has open primaries. Nowhere in Texas are you required to say that you're a Democrat or Republican. You're not required to be registered. Okay? You can vote however you want to. Come primary time, you have to vote in that particular primary. The only restriction in Texas with open primaries is if you vote in a primary and there's a runoff, then the only people that can vote in the runoff are those who voted in the original primary. All right, so how do presidential primaries go? Well, again, the early primaries have become very important to many people. The Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary, since very, very important. Iowa is assumed to represent the great Midwest, the middle of the country. New Hampshire represents the Northeast. And so how those people vote is considered to be very, very important. But you can do poorly in those primaries and win. You can do well and lose. So they're not guaranteed. It's not prophecy. All right. Next thing in your outline says National Convention. If you're following along in your book, that's on page 288. National Party Convention started in the 1830s, and they are still the means by which we formally nominate our presidential candidates. Each convention adopts a party platform and basically gets organized for the upcoming election. Typically, they meet in July, August before the November election. They have sometimes been as late as September. Again, this year, we'll see what happens, okay? Nobody, you hear all sorts of people in the media and conferences talking about what's going to happen. You hear experts talking, but you and I both know that God is the only person who actually knows what's going to happen. People are guessing. Hopefully they're guessing based on good data, but they're guessing. So that's why it's important for us to just trust in God. He's going to get us, he's going to be there with us through this. He doesn't promise necessarily that things are going to work out the way we'd like them to, but he does promise to be there with us all the way through it and with us through the end. All right, so I mentioned party platform. That's another test question for you. But the party platform is a formal statement of the party's position on current issues and is drafted as part of the party's national convention every 4 years and voted on while it's there. You need to look at the party platform. It doesn't necessarily represent the particular person running, but it tells you what the party is planning on supporting. The Democratic Party also has another thing that's a little different than the Republican Party. A certain percentage of their delegates to the commission, what are called superdelegates, okay? Those are party leaders that are there, and typically speaking, when you go to the convention, if you're a delegate, you're supposed to represent how the vote went in your state. and superdelegates can vote however they want to. All right, so what actually takes place at the convention? Obviously, the primary purpose has always been to nominate the party's candidates for president and vice president. And again, it's also the place for adopting the party platform and also for basically starting off the campaign as a unified party, hopefully. Obviously, during the primary period, there's been a lot of conflict between members of the same party, but once the convention is done, it's time to get together. If the party, Republican or Democrat, wants to elect their candidate, they need to get on board. One of the highlights of a convention is what's called the keynote address. That's usually made by some important party member, and basically it's like a cheerleader, get everybody fired up and ready to go against the opposing party. For future presidential hopefuls, this is sometimes a good way of getting your name out there for people to recognize. A number of presidents have started off with their national notoriety by being a keynote speaker. All right, let's look at a couple more test questions. Basically, potentially the convention can include a lot of balloting, okay? Because you have lots of delegates show up and they may be pretty well divided, but the idea is that there's a lot of balloting and eventual settlement by bargaining and compromise going back and forth. That's what's called a brokered convention. Brokered convention is on your outline, okay? And they need to settle things, because if the convention gets too long and too heated and too upset, then that's going to affect the party's ability to succeed in November. All right, another test question. The final major item of business is nominating a vice presidential candidate, okay? Historically, party leaders chose who would be the vice presidential candidate, but in the last bunch of decades, the decision is now usually left to the presidential nominee. Who would he or she like to have as their running mate? Typically, they choose a running mate to what's called balance the ticket, okay? To choose a running mate that maybe helps them in some area they don't feel particularly strong. For example, many times in our day, if the candidate is a middle of the road type of candidate, moderate, they'll typically choose a vice presidential candidate who's more towards their party's base, okay? For example, in the 2016 election, President Trump chose Mike Pence. Mike Pence being a conservative evangelical Christian, which is part of the Republican Party base, President Trump being somewhere not quite there. Sometimes it's a geographic thing. John Kennedy from the Northeast chose Lyndon Johnson from the South. John Kennedy being our youngest president to be elected, chose somebody with a little bit more experience. And so basically a lot of times you see that sort of thing. Maybe an older president chooses a younger candidate. Maybe a male candidate chooses a female vice president. There's a number of reasons why somebody might do that, why they might choose a particular person, okay? When Al Gore ran, he's a Tennessee president. I say Tennessee. Al Gore was really a Beltway kid. His father was a senator from Tennessee, as was Al Gore, but he grew up in D.C. He chose a Jewish senator from Connecticut, okay? So in our society, our diverse society, a balanced ticket seems to make a lot of sense, but it does create issues sometimes with credibility with the opponents, with the supporters. All right, that brings us to debates. That's on page 292. If you follow in the book, it should be on your outline. Debates have been around for a long, long time. We know about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Here's a test question for you. Television changed everything about debates. In 1960, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon were the first presidential candidates to broadcast their debates on national television. And later studies show that 4 million voters decided who they were going to vote for while watching the debate. 3 million of those voted for Kennedy. They talked to the people who only listen to the radio, most of those chose Nixon. So it came down a lot to the fact that Kennedy looked younger and healthier. His healthy tan skin turned out to be yellow skin from Addison's disease, Nixon had too much makeup and his beard showed through, and it just didn't go very well. Those who just listened thought Nixon did better. Those who watched thought Kennedy did better. So that turned out to be an important part. Now, of course, debates have become a very, very big thing, and we have a series of debates and different types. All right, next major section on your outline is election, page 293 in your book. All right, so it can be a long campaign. It can be a couple of years long. Sometimes people start their campaign as soon as the last election is over. And nowadays, it's usually 1 to 2 years. The candidates who finally make it all the way through the campaigning process, all the way through the convention process, are ready to head for the general election. There's a test question on general election. That's also in your outline. The election is held the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of an election year. Sounds kind of weird, but basically what that means, it can never be November 1st, okay? So November 2nd is the earliest it can be, and therefore November 8th will be the latest it can be. Part of election is a campaign strategy. You have to have a smart strategy to have a successful campaign. What that strategy should be, you get lots of arguments about that, but you're trying to attract as many voters as possible. So eventually it runs around to election day. So if we think about it, the presidential position is a very important position. Many, many important decisions are made not in the White House, as important as that is, not even in Congress, or even the Supreme Court, but it's made in the voting booths, okay? Because that's the decision about who's going to be directing things the next 4 years. And so that's important. Exit polls are polls that are taken to sample voters as they're leaving, asking how they voted, and the media uses those to reject who they think is going to win. They tend to be pretty accurate. Most people are pretty honest about who they voted for. But if it's a very, very close race, then it may not work quite so well. In the 2000 presidential election, it was a month before the elected winner was finally known because they had to go through the court system. You remember your history. I know you guys weren't around then, but that had to do with the Florida voting situation and some questions about their voting process. A lot of criticism these days about the presidential primaries elections. Basically, and I agree with some of them, with the time zone differences and with our fast communication, obviously East Coast polls close earlier. So therefore, sometimes the media sometimes declares who the winner is before a couple of hours before people even done voting on the West Coast. That could actually impact things by causing people to not vote or change their vote or just decide to stay home. And that's a lot of criticism. Plus, if you're like me, when somebody says 5% of the voters is we've declared the winner, you're thinking, what about the other 95%? Mathematically, that doesn't make any sense. All right, so voting, of course, is a responsibility and a civil right. Okay, it's one of our most important civil rights, but it's one that many people just ignore. If you go back, last year we were studying this in history, you go back to the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, we had the highest percentage voting that we'd ever had. Of course, you still have to remember, you're only talking about white men voting. You didn't have minorities voting. You didn't have women voting. But in this day and age, numbers have been pretty low. Basically, throughout the 1990s into the 21st century, less than half of the people who are qualified to vote choose to vote. As Christians, we don't want to be among those that are not voting. Whatever you believe a Christian should or should not do, certainly we should vote. One commentator said, bad officials are elected by good citizens who do not vote. If you don't vote, technically you have voted. You voted with a majority. You've said, I'm willing to go with what the majority says, and you've given up your right to complain later, really, if you don't do that. As a matter of stewardship, Christians should use their ballots to make the best choices possible. Obviously, we know that that's not how God makes things happen in our country. He uses presidents, he uses people. We can't make this a Christian country just by voting, but we can by our relationship with God. All right, that brings us to the Electoral College, which is the next thing on the outline. So on page 297 of your book. So normally within a day or two after the general election is confirmed, then the candidate who really, they've won, but technically they haven't been elected into office until the Electoral College votes and its ballots are counted by the Senate. Historically, so going back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the founders established the structure for elections under which only the House of Representatives would be elected directly. Senators would be chosen by the state legislatures. That was not changed until the 17th Amendment in 1913, and the president was elected by means of electoral college. And that process is outlined in Section 1 of Article 2 of the Constitution. The number of electoral votes each state has is determined by its total number of members in Congress. The popular vote in each state determines which candidate will receive the state's electoral votes. In most states, there's a couple of states that are exception, but in most states, it's a winner takes all thing. Whichever state, the popular vote determines who gets electoral votes. All right, so here's a test question for you. So why did the founding fathers choose to do that? Why didn't they just let people vote? Well, part of it was fair representation. Their intention was to give the smaller states, meaning smaller in number of people like Delaware, fair representation and to protect the rights of the few against the many, okay? That basically you didn't have Virginia controlling everything. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. In other words, from state to state, this is going to be different. Each state gets to decide how they're going to do this. Most states do it through a party state convention by the party's executive committee or sometimes in the primary. When the party's candidate wins a popular vote in a state, then the party's electors become the ones who will participate in the electoral college vote. In other words, the Republican Party in Texas chooses a slate of electors. The Democratic Party in Texas chooses a slate of electors. Whoever wins the popular vote in Texas, all of their electors become the ones who vote, just not part of them. Doesn't sound quite democratic, not to me anyway. So in most states, that's a winner-take-all system. The book says Maine and Nebraska are exceptions. I think Iowa might be an exception as well, too. Basically, in Maine and Nebraska, the electors are divided according to the winner of each congressional district, okay? In other words, whoever won each district gets a vote from that district, and then whoever won for the state will actually get the two from the state. In 27 states, the electors are bound legally, whatever that means, to support the winner. I'm not sure if anybody goes to jail if they vote differently. If you remember in 2016, there was a lot of cry for people who were supposed to vote for Trump to change their votes to Clinton. Interestingly enough, no Republicans changed their vote to Clinton, but some Democrats changed theirs to Trump. But anyway, even states that do not legally require it, generally electors vote for whoever won their state. Occasionally, an elector does something different. As I said, that happened a few times in 2016. Electoral college has a total of 538 votes, okay? That's 435 votes from the House of Representatives, 100 votes from the Senate, and then 3 from Washington, D.C. So here's a test question for you. So to win, the candidate must receive at least 270 of these votes. So 270 out of 538 are needed to win. A national census taken every 10 years, in theory. We're in the midst of a census now, which has been slowed down. The census is the only way that can change the state's number of votes and their representation in Congress. Congress has ruled that electors meet in their states to cast their ballots on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. That's even weirder than the first Tuesday after the first Monday. But it's the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. They vote. Those ballots are then sent to the Senate. Senate meets in joint session with the House. The votes are counted after Congress convenes in January. So it's not until January that technically the votes are actually counted. All right, here's several test questions for you. If no candidate gets a majority, then according to the Constitution, the House of Representatives chooses the president from among the 3 leading candidates, okay? With each state counting as one vote, okay? So basically, you have 50 states and they vote. By House rule, each state's vote is allotted to the candidate preferred by a majority of the state's House delegation. So if you have 15 people in the delegation, they'll decide who they want to vote for. If there's a tie within the delegation, the state's vote doesn't count. 2 times, presidential elections have been settled in the House of Representatives. The first one was in 1800. So one of the very first elections in 1800, Thomas Jefferson was chosen over Aaron Burr by the House. And of course, the most famous one was in 1824, when John Quincy Adams was chosen over Andrew Jackson and William H. Crawford, the one that generated what Jackson and Martin Van Buren claimed was basically a conspiracy. All right, but those are the only two times. Now, there's a couple other times that the House had been involved in the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. Basically, they decided the legality of what was going to be done. They didn't actually vote, but so only twice have they voted, 1800 and 1824. All right, next major session on your outline says inauguration, okay? If you're following on the book, that's on page 298, okay? So the oath of the Constitution is, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and I will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. George Washington added, so help me God, in the very first time, and traditionally that's been added, although I noticed in the History Channel's mini-series on Washington that aired a few weeks ago, they didn't have him say, so help me God. So there's a political statement for you. So, as the book says, after we choose a president, it's the ordinary that's so extraordinary. Even though you've had this rivalry going on, you've had all the rhetoric happening, you have disagreement, you have friends you lose, life goes on. Republicans, Democrats, independents, etc. We're all Americans. A transition team in Washington, D.C., not a military coup, but a transition team, discusses the transfer of power, the previous power, and basically we have an inauguration. Now, granted, sometimes we have years like this year when the people are yelling for impeachment, but that didn't happen right away. All right, so what are some of the traditions associated with inauguration? Well, most of the traditions were established by the very first inauguration. Washington gave a speech after his first swearing in. That's called the inaugural address. For the second oath of office, the tradition of having the Supreme Court justice administer the oath was begun. But later in administration, we added more traditions. So all that leads to a transfer of power. When Washington gave up the office of presidency to John Adams in 1797, that was the first time we had a presidential transition of power. Today, the power transition actually begins shortly after the presidential election. There are three general parts to the transition process: the use of executive orders and pardons by the outgoing administration, the allotment of funds to aid the transfer of power, and the changeover to incoming administration's personnel. So let's look at each of these separately. All right, first off is orders and pardons. Executive orders are presidential directions of actions that, although they're not law, they have the effect and force of law. Usually, they're directed towards federal government officials and not towards citizens or agencies. Constitution has no specific discussion about executive orders. There's a number of reasons why a president might use executive orders: personal, practical, political, and they're input without any put in place without any input or interference from Congress. Many times the president is doing things they think they should do, and a lot of presidents have done that. President Trump has done a lot. President Obama did a lot. Many presidents have done a lot. President Truman, for example, used an executive order to desegregate the military after World War II. He didn't get any help from Congress about civil rights, so he said, okay, fine, I'm the commander-in-chief. I can desegregate the military. A number of presidents have done things to the military, especially having to do with the status of homosexuals in the military. A lot of that's been done by different presidents with executive order. Some presidents use it as a way of establishing a legacy, things that they will be remembered for, hopefully for good, not for bad. But those are what are left, okay? The president may also issue pardons. Presidential pardons are issued by the president to release a convicted person for the remainder of his or her sentence. And these are usually done at the end so as not to create so much controversy. Okay? President Washington actually pardoned the Whiskey Rebellion rebels in 1795. President Andrew Johnson pardoned Confederate rebels in 1868. President Ford pardoned Nixon. President Carter pardoned Vietnam draft dodgers. All right, so Then we also said all this costs money. So that leads us to the second item, which is Presidential Transition Fund. Before 1963, basically, whichever party won, they had to come up with the money to do all that. But realizing as part of that was Congress in 1963 passed the Presidential Transition Act and allocated funds to help the orientation process. And then, of course, the third thing is a changeover of personnel. When there's a change in power, obviously lots of people's jobs are changed. Over 7,000 civil service jobs are opened up when a new person comes in. All right, let's talk about the event itself. So the test question, official date, the founding fathers set up the first presidential inauguration to take place on March 4th, 1789. They chose March 4th, 1789 because that was the day the Constitution went into effect. So until 1933, March 4th continued to be the inauguration day. In 1833, you might recognize it being during the Great Depression. And that was a recognition that we were in trouble, and people voted for Roosevelt because they wanted him to change things, and so they wanted him to change things sooner. So Congress adopted the 20th Amendment in 1933, which changed the date to January 20th. And so President Roosevelt was the first president inaugurated on January 20th in 1937. But lots of things have taken place since then, okay? And then lots of traditions, inauguration parades, things like that. What do you do during the parade? All those are different. Fundamentally, that's all I have for chapter 13, okay? So again, obviously there'll be more questions than that, so it's important that you've got good notes. Y'all did pretty well in the last test, and hopefully we continue doing that, and which should keep your test correction grades up too. So remember, at this stage of the game, there's not much in the way of grades other than test corrections and your current events. So you got to keep those rolling. It's going to be, can't really do the quizzes and stuff like that. But, all right, so we'll sign off for now, and then you can watch this, and we'll catch you with this again if this works out okay.